I want to welcome Jared Millman, giving our first presentation about NetworkX. Jared, take it away.
Okay, well, thank you very much. And I've been really enjoying this meeting. And I'll be talking about NetworkX, which is a network analysis tool in Python. And basically, I'll be talking about revitalizing what is a core scientific Python package. Our proposal for the CZI funding was revitalizing NetworkX for complex network analysis. And I'm sure it's like many of the applications, we basically propose to refactor our code, to add functionality, to improve performance, to make a major release, and most importantly, grow our developer community. So far, we've had one release coming out, and 2.5 came out in August. We're about to release 2.6. We'll have another 2.7, and then finally the major release 3.0. And in this 2.5, 2.6, 2.7 release cycle, we've identified quite a bit of code that needs to be deprecated, and so there'll be a host of deprecations in 3.0. We've also started adding some new functionality and new API as well, which will be slowly showing up in the 2.6 and 2.7 releases. Yeah, so going to this title of our proposal, so you can just ignore this for complex network analysis. I will really not talk much about that in this 15 minutes. There may be a slide. And then continuing back from the right to the left, I will be starting by talking in the first half a little bit about what NetworkX is. And then in the last half, I'll really talk more about what we mean by revitalizing and why we need to. Before I tell you what NetworkX is, let me first remind you what a network is. So I'm going to go very quickly through this, but a network is basically a set of nodes connected by edges. You can often see drawings like this, where 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5 are our nodes. And you can see they're represented, these edges are represented by lines. In math, sometimes you represent them in these sets format. These can be much more complicated objects. The edges could have arrows on them, some sort of directionality or causality. There could be additional information on the nodes or on the edges that are used in algorithms. The nodes could be things like proteins or genes or individuals or predator and prey. These connections or edges or lines could be sort of friendship or interaction or some kind of causal nature. And I'm sure without going into too much detail, everyone's seen these graphs or networks and probably have concrete ideas about what they could be in your own research. So now that I've remind you what a network is, let's talk about what NetworkX is. And also often refer to it as just NX, which is how we import it. So I mentioned in the brief blurb in the beginning that, or in the previous section, that NetworkX is a reference library for network science algorithms in Python. You can see it's got a whole ton of key features. Simple design and flexible data structures are really at the heart of our focus. It's also very easy to install and use. It's a pure Python library at the moment and probably will remain more or less that way for a while. It has a broad range of algorithms. We're very open to new algorithms. We accept heuristics. We accept, obviously code that's been in publications, but people can just come in, and if they have an algorithm that makes sense and it works, we can understand it. It's often allowed to come in. We often have multiple algorithms for the same sort of computational problem in the reference sense. We also have support for many file formats, and many other packages support NetworkX graphs. We have good documentation, basic drawing. It's well tested and open source. The one thing you don't see here is a focus on performance or speed, although we're thinking more and more about that. But that's not been a traditional focus of NetworkX. We currently have a fairly good size core developer team, although a lot of the work is still done by a very small group of us in that core developer team. This core developer team was also set up as part of this grant. So I'll talk more about our community and formal structure in the second half of this talk. We also have a wide number of contributors. Last time I looked, I think it was up to 444 contributors, and there's probably 20 or 30 more first-time contributor PRs that we haven't gotten to yet. So just a really quick example. So here's a little network, the nodes A, B, C, and D. Here I've drawn weights on the edges, and I've made the edges thickness correspond to their weights. So you just import NetworkX as an X. You create a new graph called G, and then you can go ahead and just add the edges. So the edge AB has got weight 4, and so on. And then you can run an algorithm like shortest path. So here we're asking for the shortest path in the graph G between nodes A and D. And we're looking for the shortest weighted path, not just the distance, the number of edges you're walking. And this is a simple enough example. I'm sure everyone can see that A, B, and D is shorter than A, C, and D. And I should also say that, because we won't get much more into the code, there's lots of ways of getting graphs. So instead of just drawing them edge by edge, you can read them in. We also have a number of graph generators for random graphs or complete graphs or on and on and on. There's a bunch of generators for graphs used in social community network analysis. And we have just tons and tons of algorithms in addition to shortest path. But it gives you some sense of what it looks like. I also just wanted to take a moment to talk about this core data structure we use. So I'm sure a lot of people are very familiar with NumPy arrays, and that's, in a lot of the scientific computing stack, that is the fundamental data structure. NetworkX does not fundamentally rely on that. I mean, we do have an array version of graphs, but for many of the algorithms, this dictive dicts is a much more reasonable format. And so you can just see here, if we look at this graph G as a dictive dicts, they're keyed by the nodes, and then the values of each of those nodes are the neighbors, and each of the neighbors also has its edge attribute, which is also a dictionary. So it's a dictionary of dictionaries of dictionaries. Just a little bit more of that. So again, it's just keyed by nodes, and then the values of the dictionary with neighbors as keys. G nodes gives you whatever you put in, right? So this is a dictionary. So if it's hashable, then it can be a node. So it doesn't have to be the 1, 2, 3, or 4. It could be an XML file or an image or just about anything you can imagine, as long as it's hashable. And the edges are tuples with optional edge data, which is also stored in a dictionary, as we saw before. Why do we use this dictionary of dictionaries? One, it gives a very natural syntax. So if you index U and G, then you'll get a dictionary of neighbors of U. GUV returns the ed attributes of the edge UV. N and G test if the graph contains the node N. And then you can also loop over the nodes in a graph just with this for N and G. Dictionaries are very efficient representation. So this inherently is an adjacency list representation, which is really good for sparse graphs where you don't have to store all of the missing edges. It also allows us to find edges and remove edges with 2 dictionary lookups, which is really important for a lot of network style algorithms where you often are operating from one node and walking along edges that are adjacent to that node. And then Python dictionaries are highly optimized in Python, as we all, I think, know. So here's my complex analysis slide. So network analysis with NX is really nice because this flexibility in our data structure, we're allowed to have arbitrary edge data and node types. It also, as I mentioned, allows us to we enable reading and converting to many different graph formats, and we're interoperable with many other graph and array libraries. And it's easy to use as a pure Python library. It's inherently multi-platform, readable, well-documented, and well-tested. And it's powerful. There's hundreds and hundreds of functions for creating, manipulating, measuring, studying, and visualizing networks. And although these sizes are getting less and less large for today's data sets, you can handle data sets with 10 million plus nodes and 100 million plus edges. That's really at the limit of what NetworkX can do at the current moment. But it scales up fairly large. And for many people's use cases, these are not crazy small graphs. All right, so why does NetworkX need revitalizing? So I want to give you a little bit of history of NX. It's probably one of the older libraries that we're going to be talking about today. NumPy, it's arguably older in terms of its history, but I'll mention that again in a moment. So in 1998, Guido van Rossum wrote an essay about implementing graphs where he proposed using a dictionary of lists. So I mentioned dictionary of dictionaries, but the initial idea was to use a dictionary of lists. And then NetworkX started around 2002. Initially, there was, I think David Epstein had proposed using this dictionary of dictionaries instead of the dictionary of lists. And then at LANL, Eric Hagberg and a colleague started NetworkX in 2002, and they were interested in looking at analyzing data and intervention strategies for disease spread and epidemiologies, which is maybe relevant today. It was also designed to study structure dynamics of social and biological and infrastructure networks. And it was really this research project that was started to do their work, not intended to be a general library. In 2002, Python was a fairly niche in the scientific computing world. By 2004, it was announced at the SciPy conference, which I guess would have been the third or fourth SciPy conference. And at those years, we were 40 to 50 people meeting at Caltech. And then 2005 was the very first public release. And just to give you some context, I think it was publicly released maybe 3 days or 4 days after Git was first publicly released. And a few months before Travis Oliphant started the effort to merge numeric and numarray into what is now known as NumPy. So obviously, the very first versions of NX did not support NumPy because it didn't even exist at that point. And it didn't use Git or GitHub because Git had just been released, and GitHub, I think, was probably another 3 years away from release. At this point, for those people that are much more new to the community, SVN was a much more difficult version control system. Collaboration was much more difficult, and the community of people interested in studying Python was much, much smaller. And the tooling was just nowhere near as stable and as useful as it is today. Between 2005 and 2010, the community started growing. And in 2010, there was a 1.0 release. And I believe either at that time or shortly after, it went to GitHub. And with the 1.0 release in GitHub, the developer community really grew. So, grad students started showing up and contributing. And fairly soon after the 1.0 release, it started being more commits were coming in from graduate student new contributors than there were from the original developers. And then that started coming up to a 2.0 release where they needed a major interface redesign, largely because of the some of the things that happened between Python 2 and Python 3. So 2.0 was much more of a Pythonic 3 kind of focus. However, a lot of new projects, and this can happen with a lot of things. It was an overambitious release, and so by 2016, they had gotten a lot of the tooling and stuff and design stuff in place, but it just got overwhelming to release, and there was about a year where the development just kind of died down. And I think for that year, 2016 to 2017, there was just a handful of commits that got merged. And it wasn't clear if the 2.0 release was going to come out. I had been involved in the scientific community early on, but then I went to grad school around 2012 or 13. And because of that, I had stopped contributing to open source programming. And around 2017, that summer, I decided I wanted to do some more programming because I had been mostly doing math. And I looked around, and NetworkX seemed like a project that could use some help. And so I thought I'd give myself a month working on it and try and get this 2.0 release out. I was half successful. We got the 2.0 release out. I was not successful in spending a month on it, so I've been working on it ever since. But the problems we had in the 2.0 release basically meant that we lost a lot of our core developers, in part because it got very difficult to contribute. And then the people who had been contributing moved on, got new jobs. Eric Hagberg got promoted to where he didn't have much time to develop as well, the original author. And so between 2017 and 2019, we were really in a maintenance mode. We had regular releases, new features were added, cleanup was being done, but we really weren't attracting new core developers at that point. And so around October last year, about a year ago, I decided this needed to get fixed. I started talking to Stefan Vanderwalt and got him interested in the project, in part because we were having problems with nose and we needed to switch to PyTest. And so we dived into that. And then Stefan and I started talking about how we were going to deal with this, and realized this would be a really perfect opportunity for applying for a grant from CZI, which we did, and was fortunately funded, which has made a huge difference for NetworkX. So how goes the work? Well, over the last year, we've done a lot of work on the code, the structure and process, and the community. In code, we've done the normal adding and improving of algorithms, the PyTest conversion, but we also did a lot more work on the testing infrastructure. We've also spent a lot of time removing legacy code. So we've removed, I think, all of the 2.0 code, but also recall this was a project that started in 2002, and so the NumPy code was a fairly legacy. It had been converted from numeric code, I think, possibly NumArray. But a lot of the new work in NumPy hadn't been incorporated, so we've gone through and cleaned up a lot of that code. We still have more to do. We've also thought a lot about how to improve the code so it's easier for people to contribute. And one of the things I want to emphasize or encourage people to use is Black, which is if you go to GitHub PSF Black, you'll find more about it. It's an opinionated code formatter. It's automatic. You may not like the style, but I think it's really important to just have something like this done, because what we were finding was that people would submit a PR and then there was this nitpicky stuff about spacing or whatever else, which is annoying to do as a feedback, and it's super annoying for a new contributor to deal with. So this Black code formatting has just allowed people to run it, and we've just stopped all discussion of code format, which I think allows us to focus on the content of the algorithms. For structure and process, so for a project that started in 2002, we really hadn't done a lot of things, and we didn't have a logo. We didn't have a we had a website, but it was just the GitHub website. So we've created a logo. We've acquired NetworkX.org. We've also formalized our governance and decision-making processes. Basically piggybacking off the work that had been done in NumPy and SciPy and scikit-image and scikit-learn to formalize these process. We also joined NumFocus, which I went back to my last night, looked at my 2012, I guess, emails, and it was very clear that when we were forming NumFocus that NetworkX was one of the projects we expected to be part of it, in addition to NumPy and SciPy and all of that. Matplotlib and IPython and maybe Jupyter wasn't around then. But we finally just did it this year. So it's happily, I think this week we got we had originally joined as an affiliated project, and now we're a fiscally sponsored project as of just a few days ago, which hopefully will allow us to start bringing in tide-lift funding and other things. In addition to this governance and the decision-making process, we've done a lot of focus on community. So we've adopted a code of conduct. We've added a mission and value statement. We've done a lot of work improving the contributor and core developer guidelines. And we've also created a roadmap, and we've implemented an enhancement proposal process like the PEPs that Python has, or NEPs that NumPy has, or skips that scikit-image has, and so on. So just to have two gallery slides examples I wanted to mention. So we used to have shapefile support, which we've deprecated, and we've reached out to the geospatial community, and they've provided us with a bunch of examples. And we've also contacted igraph. So I noticed this year that igraph, who's speaking next, added for their Python bindings support for reading and writing NetworkX. So now we have examples of that, and it was a really great process interacting with both of these communities. We found out that their drawing didn't work with Sphinx Gallery, and then open up a PR and they fixed it. And so the next release that will work, which will be great for the community and everyone else. And you can find more information on our website. Thank you very much.
Just make a comment here that one of the things I'm realizing as we studied all these applications and projects, like the exact history, like what you just presented about the ups and downs and digressions in the history of a software package are so insightful, and very often they're not publicly visible. And so just hearing that is fascinating, and I think super helpful for all of us. We can move on to our next presentation, and I think that we're going to have Shabuch leading the presentation for igraph.
So my name is Szabolcs. I'm with the igraph team. We have 5 people on the team right now. And I'm going to show you what igraph is, what it's good for, what you can do with it. Maybe some more of you will find it useful. Some people are already using it. Maybe you're interested in how it works internally. And we also hope to find some new collaborations maybe. So what is igraph? igraph is a general purpose software package for network science. So Jared already told a little bit about networks and graphs in general. Here's a complex network on the right. This is the kind of thing that igraph can work with. It can represent these objects. It can assign attributes to the edges and the vertices or nodes of these objects. It has many algorithms to run various analysis. For example, you can see the result from a community detection in colors. You can see different size vertices based on a computed property and so on. So it's mostly used by network scientists. That was the original goal. For network analysis, network modeling, it also has many random graph models to generate such things, compare with real world data. And it's also a package for graph theory, not just network science. And maybe some people are a little bit surprised, like, what is the difference? So network science is mostly statistical analysis and real world data. And graph theory is sort of the foundations. It's the mathematics of graphs when you have nodes and connections, just as a very abstract concept. There is, in fact, not that much interchange between those two communities, the mathematics part and the data analysis part. And personally, I'm really pushing graph theory as a foundation for igraph as well, because I think it's important to have robust, reliable methods that are mathematically well-founded. This is also actually a major focus of my research. So why networks? What are those good for? So all of you probably know many examples of real-world network, from Facebook to actual social contacts to the internet, but there's also many, many examples relevant to biology. All the examples on these slides are biological, such as metabolic networks, gene regulatory networks, network of neural connections in the brain, which is, again, one of my research topics, vascular networks. One image that many people will recognize actually from CZI website is a network of similarities between cells based on gene expressions. This is actually how some of the other funded projects use igraph for the clustering to identify different cell types. And maybe one of the best examples of why a network view is so useful for many problems is the network of social contacts, which is also a biologically relevant network because it's the underlying network for disease spreading, which of course is a very relevant topic today. We're all told to social distance, to have fewer contacts. But the point is that the average number of contacts a person has, that's not enough to predict how a disease will spread. That's not the only thing that influences how disease will spread. The specific network structure is just as important. Two networks with similar average number of contacts but different structure may behave very differently. And this is the kind of thing that people use igraph to explore and play with. So who uses igraph? A lot of people use igraph. Yesterday I looked a little bit on Google Scholar. It has 7,000 citations, lots of dependents for the Python interface on GitHub, for the R interface, lots of dependents on CRAN. There are also some, at least two, probably perhaps more users among the funded projects from CZI. But despite being so popular, actually the project was languishing a little bit in the past few years because, as you know how it is with open source projects, people get new jobs, they have less time. igraph used to be a two-man team mostly for most of its existence. So the CZI grant had actually been a huge boon for igraph. We organized a new team and it's back up to speed, and we hope to move it forward significantly within the next year. So I thought I'm going to talk a little bit about how igraph works and its architecture. So it's written in C because performance is one of the major goals for the projects. So it wants to be a general purpose tool for networks, but it also wants to be as fast as possible. So we have a core graph representation, which is very small and has a very stable API, and in principle could be swapped out. This is implemented in C. And around that, there is a library of various network algorithms, analysis techniques, and so on, also mostly implemented in C and C++, and having a C language API. But most people actually use igraph through high-level interfaces in various high-level languages, R and Python being the two original ones from back in 2006 from igraph's inception. And now we have another officially supported interface for Mathematica, which is developed by myself. So these, don't think of these just as bindings which expose the C functions. These are actually they try to be very well integrated into the host language. The Python interface wants to feel natural for Python users, be very Pythonic. The Mathematica one interoperates seamlessly with Mathematica's native graph data type. So users don't even have to think about moving between the two. So, and some functionality is even implemented directly in these high-level interfaces when it uses features from the host language. And we hope to migrate some of these down to the C core. So this is how the project is organized. This is how the library is organized and how the system works. And it's good to know that it works on all major platforms, which is kind of a challenge given that it's written in C. But we're trying to support all platforms. And made some progress towards that in the last few months with better Windows support. So when people use igraph, just like NetworkX, it's a programming library. So it's not a graphical tool like, for example, Cytoscape or Gephi, which those of you who work with networks might know. But you write code often in a notebook interface and often do some interactive data exploration, like in the screenshots on left Python and right Mathematica. And it has been designed from the ground up to make it easy to integrate really tightly into the host language and to make it suitable for interactive use. It has a number of features which users don't think about, but if they were lacking, they would immediately notice. For example, it's interruptible. Most of the algorithms can be interrupted. For example, you do some work in R, there's a red button in the GUI, you just press it. If it's taking too long, you can stop it. And with graphs, it will often take too long because some algorithms have exponential complexity, so you might not be able to predict how long it will take. And this is a non-trivial feature that's present in the library. It integrates with the host language's random number generator, so you can use the host language's seed function to have reproducible results. It has hooks for errors and warnings, for example. Errors come up as proper exceptions in Python. The storage for vertex and edge attributes is flexible, so you can again have that as Python objects in Python or R objects in R. And it even has hooks for progress reporting for tasks which take long, which I'm going to show you a little bit later. So I thought I'm going to show a few demos just to illustrate how this works and how people work with it, and show some things of what you can do with it. So here's, for example, the Python interface for igraph. Let's load the package. 0.8 is the latest version. And by the way, now you can just install it with pip. So now we have binaries for all major platforms, which was a major achievement after CZA funding started. So let's just read in a graph from a file. It supports many common graph formats, such as GraphML. We can plot it easily. Here's the layout. I can plot it again. It looks different. Why? Because this layout starts with a random arrangement of the nodes and then use a force-directed approach. Again, a different one. But if I set the seed in Python just with the native facilities, and I do that again, then I get the same thing. So just to illustrate that it actually is using Python's random number generator here. In R, it would be using R's random number generator. It's really easy to do simple analysis, or even, well, it's really simple to do not so simple analysis as well, such as community detection, find groups of nodes which connect to each other more, color them. If it's a hierarchical clustering method, plot a dendrogram. This is all just one line. It's also very nice for prototyping new algorithms in the high-level interface before maybe implementing it in C for all the interfaces. For example, here's a small example of click percolation, which is a method to identify perhaps overlapping communities in the graph. It starts by finding clicks which are completely connected subgraphs of a graph like this one. So this is one complete graph, and this is a complete graph, this green one, like that, identified in the larger red one. And click percolation simply moves all nodes into a single community if they are part of clicks which overlap in all but one vertex. And implementing it is, again, really simple. It's just a few lines. We can do it for several different click sizes, get the results, or we can even use the interactivity features of Jupyter notebooks and see what kind of community structure we find with different click sizes, like that. Another interactive feature I wanted to show off was the progress bar. I try to hook it up to Jupyter's progress bar. I'm not very experienced in Python, but as you can see, it was fairly easy to do. And as the calculation goes, you can see the progress. Show some community detection. So again, I load the package. I can, for example, make a nice Sierpinski triangle graph like this. And igraph is very strong in community detection. It has many algorithms. Some of them, you can adjust the resolution and have fewer communities which are larger or more that are smaller. So I thought this is a cool illustration, especially if you do it interactively. So the method is fast enough that you can increase the resolution, get smaller and smaller communities. Or to show that whatever you can do in one interface, you can also do it in the other. Here's an implementation of the click percolation, except that this time it's on a different graph, which I extracted from much larger scientific collaboration network. Here's the function, it's just 4 lines. And again, the interactive demo with various click sizes. Something maybe a bit more relevant for other projects is that this demo was made by Fabio Zanini, one of our team members. He took some single cell sequencing data from CZI website, from the mouse. And one of the main uses for community detection is to identify different cell types. And again, we can do different resolutions and get more and more and smaller clusters, which can be animated, and the code is really small for it, like that. Or we could do the very same thing, again, in another language. This was with Mathematica, and again, it's a nice animation. And on the right, you can see that the communities we get from the similarity graph agree with this UMAP layout in 2D. I thought maybe I show another small thing. There's, for example, a toy epidemic model built into igraph. You can simulate epidemic spreading on a graph. I generate a small word network, and I can run the epidemic model on it, and I get back a native time series object in Mathematica. So always the goal is to integrate well with the host language. Then I can plot it just like that in one line, or just plot one component. This shows the number of sick people in orange, which goes up, then it goes down as they all recover. The recovered ones are the green one. In the end, everyone got through the disease, everyone recovered in this simulation. We could also run lots of them and plot all of that easily. Takes a little longer to see that there's randomness in the system. So you get different trajectories and different cases, and one can keep playing with this. But I'm going to stop with the demos here in order not to run out of the 15 minutes and move ahead and show a little bit of what we achieved recently. So igraph also needed a lot of revitalization because up to recently, it has been quite languishing. There was not a lot of development, but now we got out the first release in 5 years, 0.8, this spring. And now we're at 0.8.5 for the C core of igraph. This was made possible by the CZI funding. We also added binary wheels for the Python interface, so everyone can really simply install it on all platforms. And we launched a new user forum, which in my opinion is a very important thing because we're looking to recruit more developers and get more people interested in this. Actually, this is one of the things where I'm hoping to get some new ideas from the community on how to manage this well, because it's really a lot of, it requires a huge time commitment to engage on a forum, answer questions. Really the big question is how to turn it into a self-sustaining community. So people who joined recently, they also answer as they don't just ask questions. Maybe they will even contribute to igraph later. We transitioned to a new build system. igraph was using auto tools, which was outdated, but we just learned that the new release happened recently, just here yesterday, but we just actually completed the CMake transition, which made it much nicer and easier to work on the C core. We have faster builds, easier to maintain, better cross-platform support, especially for Windows. And of course, already in this release, there are lots of new functions, a lot of new functionality, many bug fixes. And for the near future, our top priority now that the C core is moving fast ahead again is to release a new R package. igraph is actually mostly used, well, not mostly used from R, but I would say it's the de facto network analysis package for R. So lots of users are using it from R, but we are at the moment short on R developers. We only have one who has very limited time. And here, help is really welcome. Anyone who's interested in the project and willing to contribute to the R interface, that would be very welcome. We want to do some more internal restructuring to make it even easier to maintain and easier to contribute to. Also have better documentation. Again, in the spirit of the new community forum, we want to make it more accessible. So we would be able to find more people who are interested in contributing to the project. We want to swap out the fundamental graph representation. At the moment, igraph is very efficient, as I said. Performance is one of the top goals, but it was originally designed for analyzing large static networks. It doesn't do quite as well if you modify the network repeatedly, you remove edges, add vertices, and so on. So we want to make it more suitable for that use case as well. And by the end of the project, by the end of the CZI grant, we want to have a 1.0 release with this new feature and the stable API. But of course, a network package is never complete. So there's lots of new ideas. There's no shortage of ideas and what to do. There's just a shortage of time and shortage of resources and people who want to work on it. So one of the things I'm really hoping to get out of this meeting is some more collaboration. So as I said, we are looking for R developers. We are hoping to recruit new developers for R, and eventually we hope that one of them would grow into taking over the maintenance of the R interface. And we're also looking to coordinate with other network packages, especially NetworkX, but also there are a number of other packages in Python, and hope to create a more seamless experience for users. So one of the drawbacks of using open source tools is often the landscape is very fragmented. It would be really nice if people could move very easily between various packages and analyze the same network. Use one function from one of the packages, then move to the other, and so on. This is why we started, as Jared mentioned, adding conversion functions. And we'd like to get to know the NetworkX developers and do this in collaboration, so we know what each other is working on. It's also a good opportunity to share expertise, maybe not in the programming part, but in the method part, and how to implement various network analysis methods. I mentioned transitioning to new graph representation. We would love to learn more about the experience of NetworkX, of what works, what doesn't, what kind of trade-offs there are. For example, Jared talked about the dict of dicts representation. We have to look at whether something like this is more suitable for dynamic graphs and so on. And in the end, we hope to just reduce the duplication of effort when feasible between the various projects. Also, I would like to encourage everyone here who might be working on network analysis methods. So if you have a new result, a new scientific result, a new method, then consider contributing it to igraph. Make it available to lots of people within at least 3 or 4, together with C programming languages. And finally, we are aware that several of the other funded projects use igraph. So I'd like to encourage those projects to talk to us, let us know what you need. Of course, one of the big points is a new release for the R interface. Let us know what you'd like to see igraph to do next, or how we could make it easier for you to use igraph. So I think That was about 19 minutes. So I'll wrap it up here and I'm ready for questions.
Thank you so much.
Of course, and it's a question for both previous speakers, and some of the last slides responded to some part of these questions. When should I use igraph instead of NetworkX, or vice versa? Like, is there a clear distinction? Like, in those cases, you should not use igraph. In those cases, you should not use NetworkX. And the second part of my question, which is the flip side of this coin, is how similar are the API, and are there any efforts to uniformize them if they are different, so that it's easy to just swap one for the others? A bit like NumPy, you can replace by QPy or Dask, depending on whether you want to use GPU or distributed computing.
So for the first question, igraph is available in multiple languages. So if you're going to use R, or you're going to use Mathematica, or you're going to program it in C, then you can't use NetworkX. So this is one of the major features, that it's available from multiple languages and tries to be well integrated with all of them. The other major feature is performance. This is why it's written in C. And this is also where a drawback comes in compared to a project which is written in a high-level language, that it's a lot more work to implement things. So we necessarily are moving more slowly and can't implement as many things in a short amount of a time. And for the second question, of course, this is what would be really great. This is what I try to say here, that users should have a seamless experience. It's not very clear how this could be achieved. Right now, the APIs are quite different, but actually we were thinking about ways to try to reduce the duplication of effort where it makes sense, and somehow make it easier to switch between different tools when they cover similar functionality areas, or rather they complement each other. So this is something we'd really like to talk to NetworkX about.
Yeah, I'll just reiterate that point that, so basically, I think I pinged some of the igraph Python team about a week ago, which I think might be our first conversation beginning, and it went really well. They were extremely responsive. They started making PRs for us. We made PRs for them. I also mentioned the geospatial group, which is also went really well and had recently started talking. So I think, I would really encourage a lot of the Python packages to start communicating and mentioning each other on GitHub. And hopefully more and more of this stuff will happen. I am planning to reach out to the developers more, and hopefully other projects will do something similar. And hopefully there'll be more consolidation and unification going forward.
And so with that, I would like to welcome on stage. Thank you so much for the presentation. I want to bring on stage Matthias and David for a demo about Zarr. Stage is yours.
Thank you everyone for having us, and thank you for being here. So if you're not aware, Zarr is a format for the storage of chunk, compressed, and dimensional arrays plus metadata, compatible and optimized for multiple storage backend, S3, HPC, Google Storage, and thought for parallel read and write. So if you are using HDF5 or NetCDF, that might be something that is of interest to you if you're using something which is like really big data and distributed. And it is used in a variety of fields, from climate science to biology, to store from single image to petabytes of data sets and their metadata. The slide will be available if you want to get started. You can go to zarr.wizarddoc.io. So I invite you to go there if you want. And here we have example of some data sets that have been stored in Zarr, from this really small scale to the really large scale. So Zarr is developed by the core team that you can see here. I want to thank them for helping me through the process that we've been with the CCI grant and working on Zarr, and especially to Alistair Miles, the creator. So I already covered what is Zarr, and in the past couple of months, I work on going from Zarr v2 to Zarr v3, and we'll see why there is such difference, and talk a tiny bit about the Zarr version v3 Python implementation. Then I will give the stage to David, who will show how he has with his team working to making a C implementation for Zarr, for some of the same goals that you had with igraph before, which is multi-language and performance. And so the current version of Zarr is Zarr v2 of the spec. It has initially been thought for file system-like store. So inherently hierarchical and with a lot of assumptions that the latency when you do a round trip to the local store is relatively fast. It's been implemented in Python, so there are some Pythonism in it. In particular, every data that you store, you give it a NumPy D type, which make it hard sometimes to have compatibility with other languages because you have inherently some Pythonism in Zarr. And there was also limited extensibility, even if it covers many features that a lot of people use. Everybody has their own wish of some features that would be in Zarr, and so that's lots of the things that we wanted to fix for the version 3 of the spec. And the spec is supposed to be so language agnostic, so that it can be implemented in many languages. And so here comes our v3. We're still in the process of finishing. We're close to finishing the version 3 specification. The first thing is that we wanted it to be also more friendly for key value store. More and more of the scientific data is stored on cloud storage, which is inherently has high latency when you do a network request. And so we wanted something which is better for cloud store. Have, of course, a language agnostic specification so that you can implement in many languages. And in particular, we will see that it has been implemented in C, C++. And we came up with something that has a really smaller core set of features so that it's easier to implement in another language. If you wanted to have in R or in Julia, you can have the base of the Zarr implementation, hopefully in a couple of days. And then if you need extensibility, have a mechanism to register extensions. So if you want a new data type or if you want a new specific layout of the data inside your storage, you can do that. We're close to be on the final stage. So if you're interested in that, I will strongly recommend for you to go see the current draft of the protocol of v3. If you have any comments or any concern, in particular, if you have for example, if you have a language where you have keywords and that some namings is weird in the specification, we would really love to have your feedback on that. And so the v3 Python implementation is still in progress. It's lagging a tiny bit on the specification. And on the side, you can see the same data sets open both in Zarr v2 and Zarr v3 using the same library. And you see that you get exactly the same thing. It's using Xarray, which is the next project that will be presented in this session. And right now, you can open both v2 and v3 hierarchy with the same library. There are minimal changes from downstream library, if none at all. I wrote something that allows you to show you a v2 dataset with a v3 API and vice versa. So that's relatively important because we have people that have petabytes of data or old libraries that you still want to expose Zarr. There is, of course, some performance penalty if you do that. I'm toying internally with async and await, especially for network stores, but it's a tiny bit tough, especially since NumPy, like API with square bracket in Python, expose sync API. So that's difficult, but it does work in some area. And writing the v3 codes is also informing how to refactor the v2 internal code base and make it easier to maintain. So that's why it takes some time. And we still need to work on a few of the core extensions. If you're interested, I invite you to go to those two pull requests that show you the current draft on the refactoring of the v2 and v3. And for the next part, I will try to give the stage to David if you're here, and I can show the slides, or you can show the slides, up to you.
Thank you, Matthias. I will now talk about
Yes.
the C++ implementation of Zarr v3, which is based on Extensor. Extensor is a C++ library created by QuantStack. It consists of several GitHub repositories. One is Extensor, the core computational library. It's a C++ NGRA library with broadcasting and lazy evaluation. You can think of it as NumPy for C++. And it has binding for Python, Julia, and R. Extensor IO deals with IO operations for array containers. It was originally intended to read and write arrays as NPZ format, which is the NumPy format, or image files or audio files. We also have extension libraries such as extensor FFTW for fast Fourier transform, extensor BLAST for linear algebra, and extensor sparse for sparse matrices. We also have tools, SIMD for SIMD acceleration, and XTL for algorithms and structures. When working on Zarr implementation in extensor, we have made contributions to the extensor stack in the following way. In extensor, we have implemented in-memory chunked arrays, which are implemented as array of arrays. In extensor IO, we have created file arrays, which are file-backed cached arrays and persistent arrays. They have two main abstractions. One is IO handlers, which can be a local file system, Google Cloud Storage, or AWS S3. The other one is file formats, which can be binary, gzip, BLOSC, and more. Extensor IO also have its version of chunked arrays, but they are not stored in memory. We call them chunked file arrays because they use file arrays and they are stored on a file system. And they are managed in a chunk pool, which means that a limited number of chunks are held in memory. Xarray is a new library. It implements type erasure because C++ is a strongly typed language, but with Zarr, we need to allow the discovery of arrays in a star, which we don't know at compile time. We also implemented a dynamic expression system, which allows to make mathematical operations and lazy evaluation on untyped arrays, as you would do in Python, for instance. Extensor Zarr is also a new library. It allows to read and write Zarr arrays using extensor IO's chunked file arrays. It implements Zarr v3's store API for hierarchy access to be able to get and set key value pairs. It allows delete operations, list operations, and groups. It implements a part of Zarr v2 to read and write arrays. For tests, we check compatibility with Zarrita, which is Zarr v3's implementation in Python, and compatibility with Zarr Python, which is Zarr v2's implementation in Python. What's left to do? We have still some work to do in the Xarray library, particularly to implement all of Extensor's computational capabilities, and this will allow for a Dask-like experience on chunked arrays. As an example, you can see how the Python API compares to the C++ API. So right now the C++ API is a bit more verbose, but this will improve in the future. One difference though is that a Zarr array in Python is not something that you can use to make computations directly. You first need to convert it to a NumPy or a Dask array, which is not the case with extensor Zarr, because the Z array is actually an extensor array which has full support for broadcasting and lazy evaluation. If you want to have further details, you can check out these links. We also have a bi-weekly meeting and everyone is very welcome to attend. Thank you.
And there was a question, Stefan, you got it answered around whether Zarr v3 is eventually becoming Python wrapper to extensor Zarr, or these two efforts are independent.
So the two efforts are mostly independent. We want to try to keep Zarr as like purely Python as possible, and especially since, as David mentioned, Zarr the implementation of Zarr is directly allow you to do computation on values, while the Python Zarr does you basically just interact with data and you pass the data to Dask or to NumPy or to QPy and operate on that. So they have relatively different goals. One is like storage and computation. The other is mostly storage and abstraction layers for many stores. but basically both can interact with the same sets of data, which is stored permanently on disk or on the cloud storage. Does that answer your question, Stefan? Was it Stefan?
Yeah, I think so. I guess the question was, it sounded like Xtensor would be able to speed things up quite a bit. So, and then it's basically a lot of functionality has to be fully duplicated. I understand the language differences, but so if people want a fast implementation of Zarr, would they go towards the Xtensor version?
So Xtensor does replicate some of the functionality of Dask, NumPy, and Zarr. Zarr itself will not do computation, and so you can't really, like, most of the speed of Zarr will be basically governed by the latency and the speed of your network connection or your hard drive. The only thing that it will do is, well, there is of course some compression and decompression of chunks, but that is handled by the codec you use, which is, for example, BLOSC or LZ4, and those things are also implemented in C. It's the same distinction when people say Python is slow, but NumPy is fast, because NumPy is Python, but NumPy is written in C. So the part of Zarr that are computationally expensive are either given to another library, so they're fast, or implemented in codecs which themselves are implemented in fast languages. So the fact that Zarr is pure Python will most likely not impact a lot on the performance. One thing that does for online store is concurrency and the ability to have async await, but then it's not a question of purely compute power, but it's a question of this asynchronicity, and hence some of my comments around trying to get async await inside of Zarr. But there are ways to do it with threads, so it's already using some parallelism to fetch chunk parallelly.
Gotcha. Thank you very much.
Can I just add a quick follow-up to that? The one question came up recently on our issue tracker that's related to this about indexing. So, right, like one thing that would be good to have that Xtensor could provide, but maybe we would want to implement otherwise, is the ability to lazily index a Zarr array. Right now, if you try to do any indexing on the Zarr array, we'll load it. But you know, it might be, we discussed the idea of having some kind of lightweight wrapper that would allow you to index without triggering loading. So anyway. Awesome.
Thanks.
I think we have time for like one short, like quick question from Emil. If you want to mute yourself.
Yeah, hi. Great work. Really interesting stuff coming. But I was wondering how easy would it be in Zarr version 3 to create a custom store that wraps like the real store for caching, for example, some like custom caching, and the same question for Xtensor Zarr too.
So that's it depends what you will do and where you want your caching to be. If you're using a single machine and a single core, a single Python process, it's not too hard. You just wrap it. If you want to have something which is like distributed computing, like Dask, and you will import the Zarr library in many compute nodes that will each talk to the store and each get a different chunk because you want to do chunk manipulation. If you know your chunks, like each of your process are computing different chunks, then you probably don't need caching or don't need locking. But if you know that they're going to talk with each other, then you have to have a synchronization primitive that is across machines, right? So that will depend exactly on your use case. And there is already some stores in Zarr that are doing local caching, especially of metadata, not often of the chunks themselves, but of the information around the chunk, so that it's all stored locally and you don't have to have all those round trips to external store. There is also, I think, that you usually don't want caching, but you might want to have transactions. And so, for example, you would want to have, right now, as soon as you write to an array, Zarr will commit the transaction. You might want to have a block where you will do many transactions and not write the chunk to the store until you're done with this transaction. And that's something that might need to have some refactor in Zarr, so that you say, here, I'm starting a transaction, don't do anything, everything is in memory. And once you're finished, recompress the array and send it. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, I guess, yeah. So our use case would be probably more, either just reading, right? And just placing some data close to the computation, or writing, but writing would be probably embarrassingly parallel. So without
So
any.
yeah, that should be pretty straightforward.
Great, thanks.
All right, thank you so much, people. Thanks, Matthias and David and the rest of our team. We're going to move on to the last presentation in this session, and we have Joe presenting on Xarray. So Joe, stage is yours.
All right. Well, thank you everyone for sticking around to the end of the session to hear me talk about Xarray a bit. So today I'll be talking about the Xarray project, which provides n-dimensional labeled arrays and data sets in Python. We were funded under the second round of the CZI EOSS project. We're a NumFocus fiscally sponsored project, and the funds are actually being routed through NumFocus. Really quickly, there we go. So I'm a scientist. I work at the National Center for Atmospheric Research in a new nonprofit called Carbon Plan. Do a lot of open source software things. I work on the Xarray project and a bunch of others. I've spent time working on projects like Dask and Intake and Zarr, which we just heard about. There's a bit of contact information. All right, so here's my mic drop moment. Scientific data has labels, and what I mean by labels in this case is that there's metadata associated with almost all scientific data. So I'm looking at some data that came from a weather or a climate model here. You can kind of see North America if you squint appropriately, and you see that there's metadata all over this figure. So it's representing the air temperature at a certain height in the atmosphere. It was taken at a certain time, January 1st, 2013. And then of course, latitude and longitude make up the X and Y coordinates. So what we're saying here is we use metadata all the time to describe our data. And and what Xarray is trying to do is make it easier for you to use that metadata when you're working with your scientific data. Just briefly, Xarray is part of the scientific Python stack. It interoperates. Of course, it uses Python. It's built on top of NumPy and libraries like NumPy. It kind of sits in this kind of third tier of the scientific Python stack with libraries like Pandas and Dask and SciPy. And then, of course, there's a suite of libraries above it that either that provide domain-specific functionality that may use some portions of each of these libraries. Most of the libraries in that top row make use or interoperate with Xarray, TensorFlow being the exception here. Talk about that more later, maybe. So Pandas is a library that I think most people on this in this session will know well. It provides data frames in Python. It does things like label-based indexing and alignment, group by. It has some really nice support for missing data. It works really well with time series data. There's built-in plotting, interoperates with the rest of the SciPy PyData stack. But its big gotcha is it's not n-dimensional. It's just for tabular data. It at one point had a higher dimensional object called the panel, which has since been deprecated in favor of Xarray. So this is where Xarray comes in. You can think of it, if you're not familiar with Xarray, of Xarray providing kind of fitting in the space of n-dimensional pandas. The data model of Xarray really riffs off the NetCDF data model. So NetCDF stands for the Network Common Data Format, and it is the merging of that data model with many parts of the API and concepts that Pandas provides. So here's an example. We have a data set of multiple data variables. So here on the left, we have temperature and pressure. Those are, in this case, three-dimensional data cubes with dimensions, time by latitude by longitude. So in NumPy speak, those would be axes in a three-dimensional array, and Xarray calls those dimensions and provides names. The data model also provides for coordinates. Those coordinates can be one-dimensional indexes. They're actually in present-day Xarray, those are pandas indexes, but that we assign to specific dimensions. You can also have multi-dimensional coordinates. So in this case, elevation or land cover. And finally, there's the opportunity to assign metadata in the form of attributes to either the data set as a whole. So a collection of data variables can have a set of attributes, or individual variables can have their own metadata. So some high-level design goals for the Xarray project. I've already kind of coined this as pandas for n-dimensional arrays. You can think of a lot of the API as being kind of a merging of pandas and NumPy that kind of builds on top of the NetCDF data model. Just to provide a bit more detail on what that data model is, it provides containers that we call data sets that hold multiple related variables. We use dimensions describing the names of axes, coordinate variables that describe the indexes, so the locations along axes, and then arbitrary metadata. A quick comparison of how Xarray uses names, not numbers, when doing something as simple as indexing. On the top, we have the Xarray doing a selection from a time series. And I'm actually using the timestamp November 28th, 2017. And then I take the maximum along a dimension, in this case, station. If I were going to do this same operation in NumPy, which I could, I would have to know the indices of the time, November 28th, and then also know the numeric axis number, in this case 2. That gives you an idea of some of the kind of most basic functionality in Xarray. Xarray also provides a toolkit for doing things like operations. So here, like I showed in the last slide, we can do the sum of x over dimension time. There's a bunch of different ways to select along an axis. Again, this is a time selection. Xarray provides vectorization when doing mathematical operations. Here I'm subtracting x from y, and we're going to vectorize across multiple dimensions. So we're going to do broadcasting based on the dimension name, not the shape. The toolkit provides higher level computational tools such as group by. Here I'm going to group by the day of the year along a time axis, and then take the mean of each of those groups. It provides database-like alignment using the coordinate labels. So here I'll do an outer join between x and y, and it'll do that alignment. Oops. And of course, we keep track of metadata in the form of a Python dictionary, so that attrs object on every Xarray object is it's basically a Python dict and can hold arbitrary metadata. One of the kind of most useful and kind of killer features in Xarray is its I/O backends. So its ability to read and write data from a variety of multidimensional self-describing data formats. So here on the first line, I'm opening a NetCDF file. NetCDF is, in its actual architecture, is basically a subset of the HDF5 functionality. And I can load in that entire data set and lazily into an Xarray data set in just one line. I can do the same thing with a Zarr backend. In this case, I'm using, I'm showing that this might be an S3 bucket that we're pointing at. It's really powerful to be able to, in just 1 or 2 lines of code, access petabyte scale data sets in the cloud. We can write to to many of these same storage formats. So we can write back to a NetCDF. Xarray does bit for bit round tripping to all of these formats. So we can write to NetCDF, we can write to Zarr, and we're developing more backends as part of our CZI grant. I'll talk to you more about that. Another one of kind of Xarray's kind of killer core features is that it interoperates and is parallelized with Dask. So Dask adds a couple major features on top of NumPy. It parallelizes array operations, and it provides streaming operations for out-of-core processing. We regularly use Xarray and Dask to scale up to large clusters, either in the cloud or on HPC. or we can scale down to smaller single machines. Finally, using Xarray with Dask is usually as simple as opening your data and either specifying a chunk layout or just using OpenMF dataset or OpenZarr. Most of the time, this is transparent to the user, and Dask is used under the hood without too much interaction. Xarray makes like real-world data analysis really easy. And so here I'm showing an example again from the climate sciences, where I open a large set of NetCDF files. I take the group by season, so I'm going to calculate seasonal average air temperature, and then I'm going to calculate the difference between the summer and winter temperature in this section here, where I calculate the temperature range and I make a plot. This is a real analysis. This is something that a climate scientist might do, and you can see that we've skipped all of the kind of nasty index handling that you would do if you were using kind of plain NumPy-like arrays. Xarray kind of sits its position in the ecosystem, means that a lot of projects, domain-specific projects, have built on top of Xarray. Xarray is certainly a tool that's useful for the end user, but domain-specific projects often find it really useful to add specific domain functionality right on top of Xarray. So we have a site on our documentation that does our best to catalog these, and there's dozens there. The top of the page is just the field of the geosciences, but as you scroll down on that page, there's many more from other fields. Of course, there's examples from kind of the more CCI realm of single cell transcriptomics, neuroscience, Bayesian statistics, and so on. So just to wrap up here, I thought I'd just highlight and kind of go into a bit of detail on kind of what we're working on now. So we're about 5 months into our CCI grant, and we're working on 3 of the 4 main things. 3 of our 4 main roadmap items are being supported by that. So I'll just go down through the list here and kind of dig in a little bit. So the first thing is looking at improving the interoperability and the flexibility of our indexes. So again, indexes are the coordinates that allow us to do coordinate-based alignment and selection and all of that sort of thing. Right now we use pandas indexes as that object. And increasingly we've been, and for years really, we've been getting requests to do things like multidimensional indexing or spatial indexing that requires knowledge of a sphere or something like that. Those are things that the pandas index object doesn't provide, and that we're going to be developing kind of an explicit index object that will kind of support extensibility in the indexing space. Something else that we are working on is what we are calling kind of more flexible arrays and computing backends. So here, this is work that's kind of been done in collaboration with just open source collaborators kind of organically. But the main thing here is that we are really interested in abstracting away the array backend. So Xarray began just using NumPy arrays. Then Dask came along and we started supporting Dask arrays on the backend in addition to NumPy arrays. And since then, new array objects have come onto the scene. So there's multidimensional sparse arrays, there's GPU arrays, and there's arrays that use that attach physical units to them. And Xarray's working to make it easier to swap in and out different array backends depending on your application. So this is work that's progressing nicely on its own, and there's a package now called Xarray Pint that implements physical units on top of Xarray, and that seems to work really well. And then there's kind of prototype level support for both sparse and GPU arrays at this point within Xarray. backends. So most of our day-to-day right now on the Xarray project is working on a big refactor of Xarray's backends. In particular, we're aiming to make the whole backend system more modular and extensible and allow third parties to develop their own backends that hook up with the machinery of Xarray's open data set and open data set function. So this is work that's being done by BeOpen, a software engineering company in Italy. And they're making really nice progress, kind of cranking through what is a really otherwise thankless task, refactoring the backend code. Finally, we have some kind of outreach and documentation activities to kind of modernize and fill out the Xarray's documentation. Xarray grew out of the geosciences, mostly working on kind of climate and weather data, as you can tell based on the examples I was giving. And we just have some generalization to do in our documentation, as well as improving kind of the suite of interactive tutorials we have. So that's actually all I have. Our documentation and our GitHub links are here. And I'll just end with saying that Xarray is a really fun community project. And we're always looking to find new ways to collaborate with people. So thank you.
Hey, Joe, thanks for the presentation. That was great. I'm just curious about was it BeOpen that you mentioned in Italy? And I'm curious how the interaction works between the Xarray team and the people there, and how how you contract out that work.
Yeah, so BeOpen it's a small company that had probably outside of our core developer team the most experience working with Xarray backends. They had done some contract work for ECMWF, the European Center for Medium Range Weather Forecasting, and to develop a third-party backend. So they were actually the first group to try to build a backend outside of the Xarray library itself. And so they were in a really nice position to be able to comment on what worked and what didn't. So they knew the Xarray code base, and they had already kind of done one pass at this. And it's worked really well. We have a kind of high bandwidth call once a week with them for 30 minutes. And they have been kind of slowly churning through it. There's like a V2 API that's already in the code base. There's a switch, like is often done in like the NumPy project, for example, when there's experimental features. So yeah, nothing but great things to say about them.
But then the interaction is through the standard developer process, pull requests and review and so forth, or does it work differently?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, so they open pull requests. We have the high bandwidth call just to kind of make sure we're keeping them moving and not letting them spin their wheels for too long. But other than that, it's like fully standard developer process.
Great, thanks.
Yep.
All right, I'm checking. I think there's another question from Emil.
Yeah, so just wanted to ask, so if you have a lot of images that kind of share the same coordinates, but they do not really align. So maybe you have like one image that's 1000 by 2000 and the other image that's 1000 by 500 or something like that. You cannot really put them in one data set. So what do you recommend for managing these kinds of data? With Xarray, of course.
Yeah, right. Well, the individual and some of the other Xarray or developers or users on the call should feel free to jump in here, but I think it kind of depends on how you're going to use them. A collection of data arrays, which is Xarray's individual array, is if you put them in a data set, they're going to align by their dimension names, which may not be what you want in this case. So what you may find is that just a standard collection, a dictionary or a list of data arrays is sufficient for, is a sufficient container for working with these. Maybe you're going to batch over the individual images, and that the data array itself that holds just a single image is still a really useful object that holds all the metadata associated with that image. So
Thanks.